Alright, today we're going to work on a large oilable bearing assembly for a Series 60 pump. If you need to get to this point, go and take a look at some of our other videos on the Series 60 pump. Now this is an older generation because it takes oil. The new ones are bearings and they're maintenance free. So what we first want to do is mark our volute cover plate so you can put it back exactly the way you took it out. Now I did make a mark on the bearing frame itself to the cover plate, which you really don't need to do because there's a bolt pattern that you have to follow in order to put it back together. So first I'll start by taking the impeller off. If you can see, the nut fell off of the shaft, so I'll just tip it over. And out comes the washer with it. Now if you notice, the gasket stayed in place. We'll put a new one on when we put it back together. Now I'm lucky because the impeller is going to come right off the shaft, like so. I'll set mine aside. If it doesn't come off the shaft easy for you and you need to use a puller, once again, we'll take the bearing assembly. And John, if you want, I can use the puller here. So I'll set the impeller nut and washer aside. Set the bearing assembly down, and we'll loosen the 4 nuts holding the bearing frame itself to the cover plate. And we'll set the 4 aside. Now what we'll do is we'll prop it up on this side. Now for the video, I'm just going to set the impeller on here like it was stuck. And we'll take our puller and bring it in, and we'll put it around the cover plate. Again, like in the past videos, you do not want to use the impeller and pull on the impeller. You don't want to dent it, you don't want to ding it. It's too fragile. All right. Finger tight it. Get your wrench and just tighten it up. Now on some of these bearing assemblies with the impeller still in place, you have to keep an eye on your puller shaft because the shaft hole of the impeller is quite small compared to some of the pullers out there. So just bottom it out and then loosen it. And John, I don't know if you can see from there, but the cover plate has separated from the bearing frame. So we know it's loose. Now it didn't pull it off completely, but it's close enough to where you should be able to do it by hand. There we go. The impeller is up on the spring of the seal. So we'll take the impeller off, set it aside because you'll reuse it. Here's your seal kit. Now if you notice, it hung right on the end of the shaft here. We'll just use the cover plate and pull it directly off the shaft, like so. Everything comes out with it. We'll throw this away because we're replacing it. And then we'll remove the white ceramic. Again, from the back side, just pop it out. Throw that away. Then there's a little rubber gasket down in here that will just peel out. Now here's a point of inspection right here. There's a little brass ring in here with 2 dimples in it. And if you notice, the dimples are up. If this is intact, I wouldn't replace it. If it looks good, clean, not broken, whatever the case, leave it alone because they're tough to put in. But in this case, I'm going to show you how to replace it, and you only get 1 shot at it. So I'm going to remove it right now. A fine screwdriver. And it pops right out. I covered it so it wouldn't go flying in the cameraman's face. You can't reuse it once you take it out, obviously, so you're going to have to use the new one that comes in the seal kit. I'm going to throw that away with the seal kit. Clean this up. Make sure your gasket area here is clean. Make sure this is clean and not pitted, not dirty. If it is, you'll probably need a new cover plate. All right, now that we've got the cover plate all cleaned up, we're going to set it aside, and I'll show you how to put that brass ring in when we go to do the whole seal kit so we don't misplace anything. So now we'll tear into this bearing frame. And the first thing I like to do is remove the inspection cover. All right, I'll take this last screw out. And then what we'll do is, don't just peel it off. You want to wiggle it a little bit, and you want to try to get it to separate from the gasket underneath, which this one came with. That's good because you can reuse the cork gasket. So we'll set that aside, and we'll set the cover aside. And now, if you notice, John, inside here, you have the wicking, which if your seal kit has leaked and we're doing bearings and shaft sleeve and everything, these are probably black or even crunchy. We'll show you how to replace them. Also, if you notice, there's clips in place here to hold the wicking in place over the top of the bearing. They're nothing serious, but you have to remove them. And they're like a bimetal, so they're real easy. One, then the back bearing is 2. And we'll reuse those as long as they're in good shape. If they're not, you can order them also. We'll set those aside. And then we'll go back in and remove the wicking. And it just comes out like so, unless it's in tough shape. And then we'll use new wicking when we put it back together. We'll remove the second one. And we'll set it aside. All right. Now we're ready to start taking apart the shaft and the bearing assembly, or the bearings themselves, which there's 2 bolts here and 2 bolts back here. Now what I like to do is I like to remove these 2 first, then you can pull the whole shaft assembly out with the bearing. Get the ratchet in here, get it on one of these screws. All right, we've got the bolts out of the back bearing. Now it can be tough to pull the whole shaft and the back bearing out. Mine's new, I'll give it a shot, push back on it. And it's going to be tough. So I've got myself a rubber mallet. And very gently I'm going to hit the end of the shaft. Rubber mallet, not a regular hammer. I'm going to set that aside right now. Let's get this front bearing out, John. It's the only thing left in the bearing frame itself. Just a ratchet. All right, I've got the front bearing out, the back bearing and the shaft out. Now if you notice, they don't use gasket anymore, they use a silicone, and it's all over the bearings. The bearing housing or casing of the bearing, which doesn't hurt anything. You don't need to clean them up because you're replacing these anyways. I just figured I'd show you that for the sake of showing it to you. All right, now I'm going to take the shaft, and if you notice, the bearing's not coming off because the coupler key is in place. So what I'll do is, now it's a Woodruff key, it's not a flat key. I'm going to put it in the vise and remove the key because they can be tough to get out. Now when you put it in the vise, you want to use this raise right here to put it in the vise. So we'll snug it up in the vise. And then what I like to use is just a fine screwdriver. Grab my rubber mallet, easy for me to say, and get it underneath the ear of this key. And once I get it out, you'll see what I'm talking about. This is actually an ear, it's not a flat key. There we go. All right. If you notice where the screwdriver is sitting, it's behind a little ear. Just give it a twist, and it starts to come out. You can see where the ear is here. All right, I'll set the screwdriver aside. Grab my vise grips, just because I don't need this little thing flying across the room. And wiggle it out. All right. Now you're going to reuse this also, so before you forget, I'll do it right now. We'll take our emery cloth and get some burrs off that I probably put on it. Just like any key that I've showed you before. We'll get the shaft out of the vise. And you'll notice that the bearing will slide right off. Again, we're not using them, we'll just throw them aside. All right, now we're at the point where we're going to inspect the shaft for scoring, for chips, for anything that might be where the bearings go. So just for the heck of it, I'm going to bring the old bearings back in. We're going to put them in place. Just put them on the shaft, like so. And if you notice, there's no play in these because it's brand new. If you're rebuilding it because you have bad bearings, there would be lots of slop in these. So I'm going to take the bearings off again so you notice where they sit on the shaft. I'll put it back on there. Obviously this is the front because it's got the lip seal on it. So I'll take them off. I'll set them aside. These are the parts of the shaft that you want to inspect. Okay? You also want to inspect this part to make sure that there's no wear this way or this way on this hub. If there's too much wear, you're going to need a new shaft also. And if you need a new shaft and shaft sleeve and bearings, you're probably better off buying a whole new bearing assembly at this point. If the shaft is in good shape and the shaft sleeve is in good shape, I'll show you real quick on how to buff this. If the shaft sleeve is in bad shape, we're going to remove it, and I'll show you how to do that shortly also. My shaft and sleeve are brand new out of a brand new bearing assembly. We'll just buff the shaft sleeve, and then at this point you can start rebuilding it with new bearings and everything because the shaft looks good and the shaft sleeve looks good. You don't have to replace any of that. So we'll just buff up the shaft sleeve. Take the shaft out of the vise. Now, we're at the point where you're going to rebuild the bearing assembly with new bearings, and that's all you're going to put it in is bearings, seal kit, stuff like that, but that's a little bit extra. To rebuild it at this point, it's cost effective. Even if you need the shaft sleeve and the bearings, it's cost effective. Now, with these type bearing assemblies with B&G, if you order the shaft, it comes with the shaft sleeve. If you break the pump down in parts, they tell you that the shaft sleeve is not available. It is available. In other words, if you had to replace the shaft with the sleeve assembly attached to the shaft and bearings and seal kit and your time and labor, it does not make up the difference. It's about the same cost as buying a whole new bearing assembly. You might save $50 to $100 plus your labor time. I would just buy a new bearing assembly if you need a shaft, shaft sleeve, and bearings. But because the shaft sleeve is available for this bearing assembly, I'm going to show you how to take the shaft sleeve off and put the new one on. You notice the key for the impeller is still in place. And then if you notice, the shaft sleeve itself is tapered on the end. So this is going to be crucial when we do this. It has to be true, flush, clean, the whole 9 yards when we do this shaft sleeve. Otherwise you've wasted time and money trying to get it done. On the next take, what I'll do is I'll pull the shaft sleeve out of the box and I'll show you what it looks like off the shaft. What I'm going to show you, I'm going to compare the shaft sleeve that's on the shaft and the shaft sleeve that's going to go on the shaft. So of course Loctite, same green stuff that I've used in the past. Set it aside. More directions. Yeah, we don't do directions here. We do it Tom's way. And here's the shaft sleeve itself. All right, I'm going to set the box aside, John. Now if you notice, the shaft sleeve is tapered on the top. Now it's flat on the back, tapered on the top. This top part, it's what's going to set up against a shaft collar. In the past videos that I've shot for you, the back of the sleeve usually butts up against a raise in the shaft. That's not how this one works. This one works with the taper, and it rests on the shaft like so. All right, now that we've done the comparison, I'll let this sit here and I'll bring everything back into play except the directions. Now I'm going to put the shaft here. The reason why I'm doing this is I got to get the impeller key out of this shaft. And again, it's a Woodruff key, so it's not going to be easy. And of course, the older they are, the worse they are. So we'll very carefully get the fine screwdriver in here again and try to get it behind the lip on the key. It's time consuming. That's why you have to weigh buying a new bearing assembly and rebuilding it right here. If it's worth your time, you can save a couple, $200-300. If it's not worth your time, plus the new warranty on the new bearing assembly, or something goes wrong after you rebuild it, you've just wasted a bunch of money rebuilding the bearing assembly, plus no warranty. There's the key. I'm going to drop it in my hand. I'm going to do the same thing to this little one that I did to the other one. Get our emery cloth, and we'll just buff it up, get some of the burrs off it. All right, key's all buffed up. We'll set it aside. It's nice and shiny. I'll put it over here with the other key. Now we'll go over to the shaft. I'm going to turn it sideways like I always have done, keeping the raise in place. We're going to heat this thing up and we're going to knock it off like we did the rest of them. Heat it up just like the ones I've done before. You get a good discoloration. Then we'll get our hefty screwdriver and hammer in here. Here we go. All right, we've got good discoloration. I'm going to take a crack at this in a second. Johnny, you're going to get one shot. And you'll remember from when I did the comparison of shaft sleeves that this one's a lot thinner. So it might split in two when you're taking it off, but it shouldn't hurt anything. All right, good and hot. Grab my screwdriver and hammer. Oh, that felt good. All right, here we go. Oh, look at that. Comes right off. Sometimes when you're prying them off, I'll take my time here. Sometimes when you're prying them off, you'll end up splitting them when you're hitting them with the screwdriver. But this one came right off real nice. There you go. Look at that. It didn't fly across the room this time either. I'm going to put it on the floor. All right, we'll cool the shaft off. We'll get all the gunk and Loctite off it, and we'll put the new one on. All right, the shaft was very hot. I've been probably cooling it down for 5-10 minutes after we cut from the last take. So it's touchable. All right. John, if you want to get a little bit of a close-up here, there's some Loctite on it. Get your screwdriver, clean it up around. This edge right here is the important edge. And if you notice in the view of the camera, it's tapered. And I'll bring the shaft sleeve in, like so. We got to get this good and clean so it sits true and rotates in a perfect circle so it doesn't affect the seal kit. So we'll clean up the shaft. We'll buff it up with our emery cloth. And we'll just do what we've done in the past. All right, we'll buff the shaft up. I'm even going to do the area where the impeller sits because it's a little gunked up. Now again, the emphasis is on the front of the shaft, not necessarily back by this collar because the shaft sleeve doesn't go all the way back. Get it good and clean. I'm going to move here. Let the emery cloth ride on that raise where the shaft sleeve is going to sit. it looks good and clean around the raise where the upper part of the sleeve is going to sit. Shaft looks good and clean, so we're ready to put on the shaft sleeve. We got this here. We've got our green Loctite. We've got the part that's no longer available. Haha. We don't need the box anymore, so we'll throw it aside. Take the Loctite out of the bag, same as I've done in all the other videos. So now I'll take the shaft sleeve, score up the inside of it. And it's good and scratched up in there. I'll wipe it out and we'll do the Loctite. All right, Johnny, you're going to get one shot at this. Again, make sure this tapered part is clean. Snap open the Loctite. And again, I like to use more than less. You can always clean up afterwards. Loctite on the shaft. Get it on the raise or the tapered part of the shaft. And again, we'll rotate it while we're putting it on. If you notice it, it'll roll itself around. And we're going to twist it just like we did before on the other bearing assemblies and pumps that we've shown you. So here we go. Johnny, you get one shot. Shaft in hand, or sleeve in hand over the shaft. Spin it while you're putting it on. Okay, don't worry about the mess. Just make sure you've got enough Loctite everywhere. Now I like to put a little pressure on it to make sure that collar and the raise right here stay where they're supposed to stay. Just hold it for about 10 seconds and it should set itself, and then let it set for about 10 minutes. We'll buff it and we'll start rebuilding the bearing assembly. All right, it's been sitting for about 10 minutes, so the Loctite is good and tight. I'll wipe it off real quick, make sure there's no excess. And then I'll buff it. All right, we've got it all cleaned up. The shaft sleeve is buffed. We're going to bring the bearing assembly housing back in. We'll install the bearings and get going putting this thing back together. Now, remember, when you get to this point, clean out the housing. There's no shaft or bearings in the way. Get out any old oil, moisture, water, debris. Clean it out good. And we'll start putting it back together. Now, the first thing I like to do is go back to your fine screwdriver. Because the bearings aren't installed with gaskets anymore, they're installed with a silicone or a gasket material, we got to get that old stuff off of where the face of the bearing itself goes into the bearing frame. So I'm going to clean that out. All right, we've got this all cleaned out, ready to go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to install the front bearing first. Johnny, I'm going to spin this around. Well, I'll leave it right there and I'll let you. I'm going to do the same thing. Get the silicone out of this cavity, but now in the oil reservoir. All right, we've got the bearing sitting here. Let's get the silicone gasket material in here. Load up the finger. And around the lip. And the excess won't hurt it any. You need that face full of the silicone gasket material also. Now we'll take this and we'll put it in place and we'll bolt it up tight. Again, oil receiver up, drop it in place, through the housing, make sure that it's flush and in the cavity like it's supposed to be. All right. Line up your bolt holes and we'll put in 2 bolts. All right. All right, now we're going to do the shaft and the back bearing. Take the shaft out of the vise. This is kind of a one-shot deal. Back bearing. We'll put our silicone gasket material on first. Again, just like the first one. Load up the finger, go on the inside ridge. All right, now, here we go. We'll take the bearing and put it on the shaft and insert it into the bearing assembly. And then we'll tighten down our 2 bolts. Like so. Insert it on the shaft. Now remember, when you put it in, oil wick receiver up. Slide it into place through the front bearing. And into place. There we go. Now, you might want to hold the shaft forward. Set your back bearing in place. Wiggle it around a little bit. Receiver up for the oil wick. And we'll put our bolts in. All right, shaft is in place. Ready to keep going. Now it spins nice and smooth. And if you notice when you get to this point, Johnny, I'm going to turn this around quick. If you want to get down in here, I want people to kind of see this. Because it's a sleeve bearing assembly, it's not rigid. The shaft has the tendency to float. People get nervous when they see this clicking going back and forth. That's normal. It's going to float. So it's just fine if you hear a little bit of a click. I'd say about a 1/16 to a 32nd of a gap. That's all it is. So now what we're going to do is we're going to install the wicking and the clips and get to putting this thing back together. About halfway. Johnny, you want to come on in? Halfway into the receiver that we talked about earlier. Tuck them in place. Take your screwdriver. Get that wicking down into that reservoir and wrapped around the shaft. Okay. All right, Johnny, keep that camera shot on there. I'll bring a wicking clip in. It keeps the wicking in place. Now, if you notice, it can only go one way. It doesn't go like this. It goes like this with the holder in place, goes over the top of the wicking. The rest of this sits on the edge of this shaft. Here we go. That's all there is to it. Now we'll do the front side wicking, half again. Drop it in place. All right, I'm done with the bearing housing frame for now. I'm going to bring the cover plate in, and I'm going to show you how to install the brass ring that I dented earlier that comes with your seal kit. Again, if this is in good shape, do not remove it. You get one shot at putting it in. If you kink it, you're going to have to buy a whole brand new seal kit. So we'll get the seal kit in here. All right, we'll set some of the goodies aside here. Brass ring, seal kit. Now I'm going to bring the socket in here. Rubber mallet and a block of wood. Now, Johnny, you're going to need a close-up of this so I can show them. This brass ring, like I showed you when I started taking it apart, has 2 dimples in it. The dimples must go up in the cover plate. If they go down, your little black gasket won't fit all the way down into the cover plate. So we'll turn it over, we'll place it into the cover plate, and you're going to get one shot at this and one only because this is a very fragile piece of brass. Get it in here square. Press it with your fingers and thumbs. Get it to where you're comfortable when you can hit it one time with the socket, rubber mallet, and block of wood. Well, that looks pretty square to me. Now, when you put the socket in here, it's got to match the outer part of this brass ring because it sets down into the cover plate housing area, so it can't be oversized. So put that there. Looks good. It's flush with the top, like so. There's no kinks in it. We didn't ruin it. So John, if you want to stay right there, get this stuff put aside. Here comes the little black gasket that came with the kit. Now it goes down in here under the two dimples. And it sits right along like so. That's why that raise is on that cover plate that I was talking about earlier also. Now comes the white ceramic. Groove down, flat sides to the dimples, like so. Now we're going to take the cover plate, we'll bring the bearing assembly frame and everything back into play, and we'll put it down on top of the bearing frame. Now this is where I told you to mark it where you don't need to, because there's a pattern to the 4 bolts that hold the cover plate in place. Now we'll put this up like so. Bring the cover plate in. We're going to lower it over the top. Careful, because you don't want to knock the ceramic out of place. We're going to align the bolts ahead of time, because on the cover plate itself, John, if you want to get in here, it shows the pattern of the bolts for the frame. So you just lift the cover plate, very carefully set it in place. And it sets down like so. We'll grab our 4 bolts and we'll tighten down the cover plate. All right, we've got the cover plate bolted on, the white ceramic in place. Next step is to put the impeller key in. The reason why I like to do it now is because it's out of the way while you're doing all the crucial stuff. But you can't go any farther without it, so we'll do that right now. All right, we'll squish it into place. Takes a little bit to put them back in, just like it does to take them out. Like so. And very gently, I'll get my vice grips. Channel lock will work too. Very nicely. Squeeze it into place. Trying to keep it level and square. It looks pretty good. It's getting there. And that looks pretty good to me. All right, now we'll reach for our seal kit and everything else. Block of wood. All right, we'll get the block of wood. Bearing assembly. Shaft on top of the block of wood. Keep the frame off of the work table. Now again, the reason why I did that, there's play in the shaft. Off the work table. We'll bring our impeller in. Impeller lock, washer, and nut. Seal kit, carbon side spring, and impeller backside washer. Soap. Around the sleeve. You do not have to worry about getting it on the seal face. It's not like toxic like everybody talks about. You can even touch this stuff with your fingers. Johnny, I'm going to move this closer to me. All right, we've got it on the block of wood. Carbon side. Soap. Now here we go. Now when I go to put this on, you might see the carbon drop. If it drops, just stop what you're doing and take a look at it, and I'll show you. Hopefully it won't, but I'm sure it will. It fell. All right. The carbon's sitting up against the ceramic. And if you notice, it's got two dimple marks in it. One on one side, one on the other. Just like the matching boot does up top. When you go to push it down, if you push it even enough, you'll match up. And you'll watch the carbon, let me get the screwdriver. You'll watch this carbon right here disappear up inside this boot. Just like so. All right, it's pushed into place. We'll wipe out the extra soap. Now, doing a balancing act because I have a great big beer belly. Take the screwdriver, good healthy one, between the tabs on top of the rubber boot and the brass ring. Hold it in place. Just give it a firm tap. What you're doing is you're seating the seal kit or the carbon side to the white ceramic. You're making that boot suck down tight. Okay? Now, spring. Impeller backside washer. Impeller. Line up the keyway. And mine's lined up, so the key's in good shape. Slam it down, keeping it on the shaft, keeping the bearing frame off of the table. Here we go. Nice and firm. Balancing on the shaft, bearing frame off the table. Give it a good shove. That's good. It's bottoming out on the top of the shaft sleeve. Impeller lock washer. Impeller nut. All right, wrench, holding it in place. Tighten the impeller nut. Snug, not extra tight. Everything is in place. Take the bearing assembly off the block of wood. Now there's a good way to tell if the seal kit is seated or not, and I don't know if the camera is going to pick it up or the microphone is going to pick it up, but you can spin it. You can hear it, almost sounds like sandpaper. That's a good tight seal. All right, now that we've checked to make sure that the seal kit is seated and in place, we're going to move on to the cork gasket and the oil reservoir cover. Now before you do this, what I like to do is take your tube of oil, snip it open. Don't add the whole thing, don't add a whole bunch, but I like to, John, I'll point at this for you, right over the top of the clips. Just squirt a little bit of oil over this part right here, just a little. Doesn't have to be a lot. And then when you go to reinstall it or you tip it a funny way, it won't leak out on you because then the wicking will absorb it in the bottom of the cavity. So we've squirted oil on top of the bearings. Now we'll just go back to the cork gasket. And the reservoir cover. And our 4 little screws. And then last but not least, we'll put the coupler key back into place, just like the impeller key. Spin it in place. Center it the best you can. Again, a channel lock or the vice grips. And like I said, it can be easy or tough to put in. These Woodruff keys are not fun to work with. All right, it's all put back together. It's ready to reinstall into the volute body. Get your gasket, put it on with your soap. I've showed you how to do that before. Make sure it stays in place. Take it, put it in your volute. Tighten it up. Turn on your valves. Make sure it's not leaking. If it's not leaking, take the rest of your oil and open up your little tabs here and fill it. Now, I'd like to give you a measurement, but there's not a true measurement to this. So while it's sitting in the volute body, what I tell people to do is just fill the cavity until the oil leaks out of the weep hole. When the oil starts leaking out of the weep hole, you know it's as full as you can get it. Put a towel on the ground for a day or two. It'll be fine. It's not leaking, it's oiled, it's ready to go. Reinstall your motor and your coupler. and then you're ready to pump some water. And I'm definitely going to smoke after this one.